The flight deck wore a thin skin of dew, the kind that slicked boot soles and gleamed under red wand light as plane captains choreographed the morning ritual. September 2nd, 1944, USS San Jacinto, CVL-30, turning into wind. The island structure hummed like a steel organ. The catapult crew signalled. Ordnance men checked the safety wires on 4 fat 500-pounders slung beneath the TBM Avenger's wings. Red Carter thumbed his harness latch twice, the way he always did, then leaned to smell the cockpit, oil, cordite residue baked into metal, the faint sweet of dope on fabric, before settling his gloves along the throttle quadrant. He rolled to the spot with the white triangle, watching the yellow shirt's palms flatten. The kneeboard map showed the Ogasawaras, Chichijima's volcanic ridges penciled with twin needles marked Radio Relay. Someone in intelligence had written corkscrew by the towers, as if a code name could tame the flak belts sketched in pencil arcs. Over the radio, the air operations officer recited the chain that stood behind every pilot. CAP for top cover, Dumbo seaplanes staged, a fleet submarine riding a lifeguard box south of the target, call signs and rescue bearings repeated until they sounded like prayer. Carter glanced at his crew, radio man hunched over the set, turret gunner giving a thumbs up, the cracked knuckle of his glove patched with friction tape. He felt the ship heel a fraction as the carrier took more wind. A plane captain had chalked "Bring them home" on a bomb's olive curve. Prop wash now teased at the letters, lifting white dust like cigarette ash. He traced the bomb fuse safety wire with one finger, not because he needed to, but because ritual steadied the hands better than coffee. He had flown practice dives on empty islands, but this morning the air already had the taste of hot metal. The LSO's hands drew a clean line. Carter eased up to the mark, set trim, pushed the throttle against the gate. The Avenger surged, tail lightening, the deck roaring beneath him in blur and spray. For a heartbeat, he rode the very lip of the world, that narrow seam where man-made runway met open Pacific. The ship fell away, the bow wave unwound like a white ribbon, and the airplane flew because the numbers said it should. Behind him, in hangars he would never see, men and women in denim had measured tolerances so fine his life could balance on a hinge pin no thicker than a pencil. The engine's note steadied. He looked east to find his section leader and west to the black stitches of anti-aircraft over Chichijima, already sewing at the morning sky. He tightened his gloves. The mission clock began. Somewhere below, a submarine crew stared at the same sky and waited to keep a promise. From the first banking turn, the island looked less like land and more like an apparatus, volcanic ribs wired for sound. Terraces cut into dark rock held sandbagged pits. Steel latticework flashed where the sun struck guy wires. The twin radio masts stood like needles above a thicket of antennae. In the cinderblock relay hut, a fan pushed warm air in circles while Captain Nakamura read the courier's paper. The Enemy Airmen's Act, clauses that reclassified captured flyers as criminals to be handled outside the customs of war. He had studied law at university. Now he led a staff section for the 1st Independent Mixed Brigade under the 109th Division. The ink bled slightly in the humidity. A runner reported ammunition counts with the same embarrassed tone used for bad weather. Type 88 75mm shells were to be rationed. Belts for the 13.2mm Hotchkiss guns were down to crates logged as sweating. Rice had been cut again. The silk tassel on Nakamura's officer's sword showed a salt-dark tide mark where his palm always rested. He initialed a requisition anyway, as if paper could conjure freight that would never arrive. The first bombs walked the ridge like a man testing a floorboard, each step closer. Dust sifted from the rafters. In the plotting alcove, a corporal moved glass markers along a grease pencil grid while the hut's coils murmured. Nakamura watched the clock jump under concussion, the minute hand shivering between ticks. They had trained to fight ships with coastal guns and to spot submarines with lookouts on whitewashed towers. Instead, they were fighting an adding machine in the sky, sorties that multiplied, losses recorded, replacements arriving by arithmetic he could not match. He stepped outside into hot light and the smell of damp paper cartridges. The AA crews worked the traversing wheels with jaws clenched, the rhythms steady, the bursts climbing. On the horizon, the attackers arranged themselves like a formation of black swifts. The tower chief shouted that the southern mast had taken a glancing hit, stayed up, and then coughed to life again, the relay still speaking to the world beyond the island. Nakamura felt his relief curdle. If the mast lived, the raids would only sharpen. His sergeant appeared with a clipboard and a question about prisoners, as if the paper in his hand were the blade itself. Obedience was simple in the abstract. It was less simple when men knelt within arm's reach, their boots muddy, their breathing audible. Nakamura signed the intake forms by habit, then paused long enough for the sergeant to look up. The raid's thunder faded to the irregular cough of single guns. Somewhere below the cliff line, boats moved like beetles across slick water, and beyond the horizon a carrier's wake unspooled, white, tireless, indifferent. The captain folded the act and slid it into his map case, as if putting the words away could slow what was coming. The sea that morning looked ironed, a faint swell running like breath under cloth. The sonar trace smudged, cleared, smudged again. Nothing close. Commander Jack Harlan kept the scope low to avoid a glitter. The lens cut a thin circle of the world. Sky, water, a fleck of yellow too square to be foam. "Bridge, up periscope," he said, and the party word turned a crew of machinists and radio men into a rescue team with one job. He broached with the delicacy of a thief, ballast shifting, decks trembling as trapped air roared past the conning tower. The fleck became a raft, then a man slumped under a May West, one hand lazily dipping. A PBM mariner checked in overhead, a pair of Hellcats carved lazy racetracks higher up, one wing rocking in salute when the conning tower broke glass to sun. Harlan pointed. The coxswain already had the boat over the side, the line handlers crouched like sprinters. Rescue has choreography. Smoke float downwind to mark drift. Talk the pilot with short phrases. "You're good, sailor. Eyes on me." Hook the raft with the boat hook, belly the dinghy to the hull. 2 men lift under the armpits in the same count you'd use to heft an engine block. The pharmacist's mate waited with blankets and tannic solution for fuel-soaked skin, the sour-sweet smell of Avgus clinging to everything. The radio man cranked the Gibson girl to tell the sky the promise had been kept. Harlan let the quiet last a minute before he looked at the rescued man's patches. Torpedo Squadron. He would ask later about the dive, about the tower with the strange top, about friends who had not made it to water. For now he watched the PBM bank and felt what every skipper on lifeguard duty felt. A nation had designed a lattice of air, sea and steel so that a single life could be retrieved from a circle of ocean as wide as counties. An impossible number lived on the back page of Harlan's notebook, copied from a briefing and underlined twice. In 1944 alone, American factories built roughly 96,000 aircraft, more than Japan produced in the entire war. That arithmetic underwrote the promise. You could risk boats and flying boats and destroyers for one man because another airplane would arrive tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. On the horizon, Chichijima's cliffs were charcoal smudges under the morning haze. Harlan squinted that way and pictured a hut buzzing with coils, a staff captain reading a law, a sword being inspected the way he inspected a valve seat. He ordered the boat recovered. The rescued man shivered, then grinned the small grin of someone who has been given a second life. The submarine settled into a slow circle. Above them, the Hellcats wagged again, and the sea returned to its calm, indifferent breathing. The relay hut held heat the way a kiln holds colour. Dust hung in the light, slicing through the shutters, turning the coil rack's glow into a kind of weather. Captain Nakamura unbuttoned his tunic at the throat and read the typed page again, though he could have recited it now. The Enemy Airmen's Act, August 1942, by authority of which captured Allied airmen might be tried and punished as criminals. He knew the familiar dance of words that made an old ritual look like law. A clerk laid out the instruments as if for a medical procedure: ropes, folded cloth for blindfolds, a ledger book awaiting names and grids, a shallow tray of water where a brush rested for ink. On a wooden stand leaned a Type 98 Shin Gunto, army officer's sword, the lacquer scabbard nicked where it had kissed a doorway in haste. An armourer removed the Makugi peg and slid the hilt free enough to check the tang for fit, then reseated it with a soft, satisfied tap. Blade length about 2 shaku, he thought automatically. 24 to 28 inches. Weight near a kilogram with fittings. An elegant machine meant for muscle and intent. The men brought in wore flight jackets stiff with salt and mud. Their boots left commas on the floor. A petty officer, Yamato by name, a temple volunteer in another life, stood too rigidly at attention until Nakamura nodded and told him, in a voice that surprised them both, to breathe. The questions would be routine: unit, target, radio codes, the devices in the survival kit. They would write down answers that mattered little now that the bombers came like weather, now that a submarine could appear under any horizon, now that the factories in America ran 3 shifts under lights bright as afternoon. This is how a people descends into procedure, Nakamura thought, not with shouts, but with forms. He initialed the page that transferred the prisoners from interrogation to disposition, and the word made his tongue taste of brass. Outside, the island steamed after rain. He could smell the sweet rot of palm fronds and the acrid parting of hot solder from wire. A shell from the ridgetop guns cracked, the sound skittering along the hut's corrugations. The clock stuttered, recovered, stuttered again. He signed twice more. The clerk slid the sword closer as if it were a stamp. Nakamura set his hand on the lacquered scabbard and felt the slight give of the leather knot, the tassel dark with sweat. "Typically," he said to the armourer, and his own voice sounded distant, "typically the senior man bears witness." The armourer bowed. Yamato swallowed. The hut's coils hummed until the pitch was almost human. Nakamura folded the act, put it away, and told himself the paper would keep him from drowning in the heat. Outside, down a path slick with wet leaves, the grove waited like a held breath. The ready room smelled of coffee gone thin and canvas life vests drying on a line strung over the chalkboard. Red Carter rubbed a stain from his glove with his thumb and watched the intelligence officer layer transparency over transparency until the map looked like a machine. "If you ditch here," the officer said, tapping a box with grease pencil, "picket destroyer within 30 minutes. Here, Dumbo seaplane. Farther out, lifeguard sub. Key your Gibson girl. Pop the die, flash your mirror if the sun helps." The words came in the even cadence of doctrine, but they felt like a promise kept in advance. They passed around a survival kit, mirror the size of a deck of cards, signalling instructions printed in tiny type, a compact radio whose crank made a satisfying little growl. Someone asked about sharks. The doc said statistically the odds were lower than the odds of a jammed primer and got a laugh he hadn't earned. On the wall, a photo showed a PBM mariner kissing down onto a combed patch of sea, spray veiling the bow. "You'll hear the Hellcats first," the Air Ops officer said. "They'll wag wings to let you know you're seen." Carter traced a finger along the air-sea rescue lattice and imagined it alive. Destroyers pivoting to new bearings, subs broaching like steel seals, big flying boats dragging their hulls into wind. He thought of machine shops a continent away adjusting production schedules so a squadron's shortages disappeared like a scarf. Numbers had a sound when translated into engines, an even crankshaft lope, the sharp tick of a magneto, the sizzle of a soldering iron sealing a frayed lead. Someone wrote on the board the figures that had become a kind of talisman: F6F Hellcat, 12,275 built, TBM/TBF Avenger, about 9,800, B29, Super Fortress, just under 4,000. A crew chief added, And every one of those birds eats gasoline like a sailor eats liberty, so remember the tankers. It wasn't bravado, it was the arithmetic of morale, knowing the country behind you would move heaven and petroleum to get you home. Carter checked his kneeboard again. Corkscrew, flak arcs, escape headings, radio tower profiles. He tucked the survival mirror into a pocket and felt it square against his ribs like a backup conscience. If captured, doctrine said, say little, give name, rank and number, wait for the war to end. The Enemy Airmen's Act made that last clause into a prayer. He looked around the room, boys wearing the faces of men, and felt the weight of the system lift a corner of his fear. Outside, a diesel tug coughed to life and the smell of warm oil carried through the hatch. "We will come for you," the officer concluded, and the sentence landed like a hand on the shoulder. Carter believed him because he had to, and because somewhere, right now, a submarine skipper was already scanning for a speck of yellow on a sheet of hammered blue. Fukuoka woke to a hot wind that lifted ash in little devils and carried the smell of soaked tatami turned sour. On the 19th of June 1945, 224 B-29s had combed the city with fire. The steel bones of buildings showed through walls like ribs. Keiko Mori walked the street in her school uniform with a bucket and a cloth, not to clean, nothing was cleanable, but because purpose moved the day. In the schoolyard, a corner had been raked smooth and someone had set up a table with a neat stack of paper and a single pen. A Western Army headquarters memo came down like weather, prisoners to be dealt with on the 20th. Keiko did not see the prisoners then. She saw the men who saw them. An officer in a stiff cap, a legal clerk with the precise smile of someone who has learned to sand his emotions flat. She heard the words as they were read, charges shaped to fit the Enemy Airmen's Act. She watched the soldiers arrange ropes and cloth with the same care the tea club used for their ceremonies before there were no more leaves to brew. The impossible statistic hovered in briefings. A single night's raid burned more than a fifth of Fukuoka, 21.5% by the engineers' survey, while the factories that fed those bombers could replace squadrons in weeks. Keiko did not know the B-29 was pressurized or that nearly 4,000 had been built. She knew only that the sky sounded like a stove and the morning tasted of pennies. She knew that when the radio crackled in August with the Emperor's voice, people cried and bowed, and on the 15th, hours after noon, trucks still ground up toward Aburayama as if history could be edited by a blade. On the 10th of August, word spread that more prisoners were taken. On the 15th, the rumour hardened into fact. Keiko carried messages between rooms because that was what girls could do. She fetched water and folded a scorched school pennant into her sleeve because she could not bear to see it trampled. She watched a legal section captain sign something with elaborate care, blotting the ink as if a tidy signature might tidy the act. She later learned some were beheaded at the wooded execution ground outside the city, where cicadas made a metronome of summer. That evening the wind shifted, the ash settled, and the burned city smelled briefly of rain on hot stone. Keiko went home by a path that skirted a row of vegetable plots now churned to mud by truck tires. She passed a gate where a boy had chalked a circle and written "Listen" inside it. She did not know who would be asked to listen or when. She only knew the trucks had gone uphill heavy and returned light. The pen on the table still lay in its straight line, a needle waiting for another thread. The path down from the radio hut was a slick ribbon of crushed leaves, releasing a green smell when boots ground it to paste. Late 1944, rain trapped under the fronds made its own weather. Drops fell on bare shoulders with patient clock-like taps. Men in field caps measured a rectangle in the soil with a spade, the way carpenters square a frame. The prisoners came without ceremony, flight jackets stiff with salt and mud, boots writing commas into the earth. No one spoke above a murmur. The grove already had its own voice, cicadas drilling a rhythm that ignored commands. Captain Nakamura stood where staff officers typically stand, far enough to see, close enough to be seen. The petty officer designated to carry the blade held a Type 98 Shin Gunto at hip height, left hand loose on the lacquer scabbard, right hand relaxed until it would not be. An armourer had checked the Makugi peg and the fit of the tang. A drop of oil flashed along the edge. Elsewhere in the theatre, Manila transcripts record a petty officer who paused to offer a brief prayer after such a stroke. Here, if a prayer was said, it would have been breath-quiet, the kind a man keeps to himself. Procedure carried its own gravity. A clerk laid out rope and blindfolds and a ledger with neat columns awaiting name and grid. Scarcity justified itself in small, tidy acts. Cartridges conserved, steel reserved for guns and ships rather than bullets for bound men. It did not make the rope noble, it made it part of a ledger line. When the moment came, it was not theatrical. It would have been quick, practiced, intimate. The petty officer stepping forward like a kendoka, blade describing an economy of motion that ended in a small exhalation from the onlookers, the sound a room makes when a serious pain finally breaks. The clerk's brush scratched the paper. The grid reference went down. The ink shone damp in the heavy air. A spade thudded, then another. Geometry closed itself. Nakamura kept his cap on because regulations required it. The tassel knot stuck to his palm. He looked once at the strip of sky between fronds and pictured absurdly the precise lines of a deck he had never seen. Catwalks, arresting cables, a squad turning a ship into wind. He imagined, from an immeasurable distance, a man in a yellow raft drinking the tinny coffee submariners always offered. That man lived inside the enemy's arithmetic, the one that did not run out. When it was over, the grove returned to its weather. Men shouldered spades and ledger with the flat fatigue of a task completed. Upslope, coils in the hut resumed their impersonal hum. Down on the rocks, the surf folded and unfolded against the island as if to demonstrate how repetition wears anything down, given time, pressure, and a continent of factories determined to keep time with the sea. The plant whistle cut the dark like a boatswain's pipe, and the river of bicycles and lunch pails streamed toward doors that threw daylight into midnight. At Willow Run, the line glowed magnesium white. Wing jigs rose like rib cages. Rivet guns chattered a backbeat you could march to. Women in denim and men with pencil stubs behind their ears took their stations with the tidy pride of crews turning a carrier into wind. They were not navy, not army, but they understood tempo and checklists and the way a nation learns to breathe in unison. A foreman pinned a fresh chart to a corkboard, defects per 1,000 falling, minutes per airframe dropping with every turn of the clock. At peak, the line would complete roughly 1 B-24 an hour, an impossible rhythm translated into bomb bays opening over islands sailors had never heard of at the start of the war. A procurement clerk walked the catwalk, checking crates of magnetos and carburetors against a list that seemed to anyone who had bled on a ramp like a litany. The clerk did not know what an arresting cable looked like, but he knew the part number for the latch that held a bay door true at 0 degrees Celsius. On a break, Rosie wiped her hands on a rag and poured coffee that had learned every lesson about endurance. She talked about a brother on a destroyer and the way letters arrived in bunches, and then not at all. A man from the refinery explained leaded high octane in a way that made you see bombers as thirsty as locomotives. Someone produced a chocolate bar, broke it in thirds, and the gesture passed without comment, because generosity had become a habit as ordinary as stamping a part number into a spar. Numbers became poetry on the board, tail assemblies per shift, gallons of avgas loaded per train, Liberty ships clearing slips with cargoes that read like victory, aluminum ingots, ball bearings, sacks of beans. In another bay, a Wright R2600 fired for the first time, the test stand trembling, the exhaust note writing a signature on the night. A boy fresh from farm work laid a hand on the cowl and felt the animal heart of America's arithmetic. No one here saw a coconut grove or a cinder-block hut, or the way a legal clerk blotted ink. They saw schedules that refused to slip and gauges that insisted on green arcs, and a clock that ran by the same rules in Michigan as it did on the far side of the Pacific. If a bomber was lost, another would come. If a pilot fell into the sea, a net of submarines and flying boats and destroyers would close because parts arrived when and where they were supposed to. The whistle blew again, lunch pails snapped shut, the doors opened, and midnight took a breath as the line moved, bright as a promise sent across an ocean. The chart on the wardroom table had one square outlined in red pencil and labelled in careful block letters. Bravo. Commander Harlan traced the bearings with a butter knife while coffee sloshed in the ship's mug, already flavoured with steel and diesel. Outside, the ocean looked stitched, small whitecaps in rows, a breeze that would help a PBM rise clean if she had to set down. The radio man wore his headset like a prayer. Angel sighted, the first call might say. Fish in the water, the next. Between those phrases sat a doctrine large enough to fill an ocean. They drilled the choreography again because repetition makes courage predictable. Smoke float to mark drift. Approach with the wind on the bow. Toss the heaving line short, not long. 2 men under the armpits, one ready for the ankle that always catches in the raft's line. The pharmacist's mate had a routine that started with boots and ended with words. Name, unit, how many went in behind you? Above them, a pair of Hellcats would likely be riding lazy eights, throttles low, wingtips wagging when the conning tower broke the skin of the sea. A mariner checked in with a voice like gravel rolled in oil. Harlan adjusted course a thumb's width and thought of the arithmetic that made this lavish focus possible. In 1944 alone, American factories built on the order of 96,000 aircraft, more than Imperial Japan produced in the entire war. One nation could dedicate submarines, flying boats and destroyers to retrieve a single airman while still mounting raids of 200 bombers the next night. The sword's message, intended to deter, slid off numbers like rain off oiled canvas. They picked up the raft on the second sweep. The dye patch spread like a bruise on the water. The mirror flashed so clean, Harlan shielded his eye with a palm. Easy, sailor, the coxswain said. You're home. Even though home was a cylinder of steel smaller than a train car and full of men who had learned to sleep by machinery's breath. The rescued pilot's first words were practical. Number of chutes, flak arc, like a zipper, a tower that looked taller than the chart had promised. He drank coffee so fast it scalded his lip and did not seem to notice. The mariner throttled up and banked toward the next box. The Hellcats climbed, tiny black crosses against an enormous noon. Harlan wrote in his log with the stub of a pencil that had recorded other lives saved, other squares worked clean. He let himself stare one more heartbeat at the spot where the dye thinned and the sea resumed its indifferent blue. Somewhere over the horizon, the island kept its ledgers with rope and brush. Here, a crew recorded a name and a time in a book bound in canvas that smelled of salt and oil and purpose. At noon, on the 15th of August, 1945, the radio in the school office crackled like frying paper, and a courtly voice announced surrender in phrases most had never heard from a sovereign. Keiko stood among teachers and neighbours, heads bowed out of reverence and habit. When the broadcast ended, the room held a silence like a held note. Someone said, "It is over." Outside, nothing changed. Heat pressed at the windows. Cicadas kept their time. Engines started. By early afternoon, a clerk appeared with papers stamped Western Army Headquarters. The same pen that signed ration receipts signed other orders. A legal section captain arrived in a cap set low, its shadow a visor against thought. Soldiers brought prisoners to the trucks, men moving with the care of those who had learned not to waste steps. The road to Aburayama twisted through laundry still hanging like stubborn flags of ordinary life. People watched from doorways and pretended not to. Keiko carried a bucket because that was a thing one could do. The dust tasted of cinders. At a turn where the slope steepened, the trucks downshifted and the city opened behind them like a map, waterlines glinting where fire crews had once fought flame until hoses breathed steam. At the sight, the captain read charges in a voice made for rooms. The words referenced the Enemy Airmen's Act, as if law could author events the Emperor had just undone. A guard palmed a paper tag instead of tying it. Whether pity or fear, Keiko could not tell. The ground at Aburayama held heat like a bowl. From where she was told to wait with the bucket, she could not see everything, but she could hear the regularity of commands and the irregular irregularity that followed. Later, she would learn that airmen had been executed on the 20th of June, again on the 10th of August, and again today, hours after the broadcast. In the moment, she knew only that trucks went uphill heavy and came down light. The cicadas did not pause for history. On the way back, the captain walked bareheaded, hair flattened where the band had sat. He stopped once, as if remembering where he was supposed to be, then moved on. In the schoolyard, the pen lay again in its straight line, a needle waiting for another thread. Keiko set down the bucket and felt the heat of the ground climb through her shoes. The radio would carry other voices now, but the day had already chosen its ledger. In the hills, the cicadas went on, indifferent, as if nothing had changed at all. The fans in the hearing room chopped the air into slow squares, and the smell was of paper, wool, and hot ink. On Guam, then in Tokyo and Manila, interpreters chased verbs across languages, while clerks stacked documents tied with string. Command responsibility sounded like a lecture until a witness spoke. Then the prose of law learned a heartbeat. A sword lay under a canvas cloth on a table. When an officer lifted it for identification, the tassel's knot showed a sweat-dark line where a palm had rested. Evidence arrived with the authority of geography. A map with grease pencil grids showed a grove and a path slick with leaves. Another showed the slope up to Aburayama, switchbacks like stitches. A ledger recorded a date beside a grid reference. A beach station log recorded a rescue at a time that matched a submarine's deck log, which matched a PBM's orbit. A pharmacist's mate had written how much fuel it took to boil coffee for a shivering man in a yellow raft. Each document nested into the next until a picture took on the weight of fact. Keiko spoke in a voice measured to be heard by men who had never stood on that hillside. She described the day surrender words travelled by radio while trucks moved uphill, the cadence of orders in the heat, the smell of scorched earth and wet rope, the way the pen lay straight on the school table afterward. The legal section captain, who had read the charges, stared at the clock as if time might rehearse a different ending. The interpreter paused on a word, bind, and chose another, tie, then settled on a phrase that made sense in both languages and neither. Commander Harlan wore khaki gone shiny at the collar and slid a logbook forward. Entries tight, sailor neat, a weather of bearings and tides, squares labelled Bravo and Charlie filled with figures like coordinates of mercy. He explained that lifeguard duty was doctrine, not ornament. Submarines, flying boats, and destroyers were assigned to retrieve downed airmen so they could fly again. A nation had built not only airplanes, but the lattice that refused to leave men in the water. He did not speculate on swords. He didn't need to. The charges named murder and the prevention of honourable burial. The judgments read like instruction books for a future in which men might be kept from such choices by rules written with enough clarity that no one could pretend not to understand. Names from Chichijima drew a murmur. Names from Kyushu drew a silence that sounded like shame. Outside, palms finally moved in a breeze. Inside, a clerk wrote the word convicted in a hand that did not betray relief. The fans kept their slow rhythm, and the room, hot as a forge, finally made something useful from heat. The story narrows to the width of a blade and widens to the span of a continent. In the grove, a sword's edge is a private horizon, one motion, one life. In the factory, a production line is an avenue that does not end, stations repeating like verses until a finished aircraft rolls into daylight. The men who lifted the blade believed that terror could deter, that ritual wrapped in paperwork could reach up and touch the weather. The men and women who lifted rivet guns believed, as a matter of instinct and citizenship, that parts arriving on time could change the sky. Begin with arithmetic that still shocks. In 1944 alone, American factories produced roughly 96,000 aircraft, more than Imperial Japan built during the entire war. A single Navy fighter type, the F-6F Hellcat, ran past 12,000 airframes. The TBM/TBF Avenger approached 10,000. The B-29, a cathedral of aluminum and invention, neared 4,000. The point is not noise, it is mechanism. Abundance turns mercy into doctrine. Dedicate submarines and flying boats and picket destroyers to rescuing one man, then replace the lost airplane tomorrow. Now zoom in, a flight deck at dawn, bring them home chalked on a bomb's curve. A submarine broaching like a grey whale, a yellow raft bumping steel and the first cup of coffee disappearing in steam. A schoolyard table with a pen laid in a straight line. A hillside where cicadas keep time as if calendars were none of their business. The dates and places stand whether anyone likes them or not. Carrier strikes against Chichijima in late August and early September 1944. 8 captured Americans executed on that island afterward. In Fukuoka, executions on 20th June, 10th August, and, after the Emperor's broadcast, on 15th August 1945. Zoom out again. Systems beat rituals. Air-sea rescue grids, HF/DF beacons, lifeguard boxes, tankers pushing octane across oceans, Liberty ships sliding down ways like coins from a mint, factories that could complete a bomber roughly every hour at their peak. Against that, a garrison rationing 75mm shells and 13.2mm belts, a staff captain initialing forms because forms existed, a legal clause trying to hold back a statistical tide. One nation decided that every airman mattered enough to build machinery that made rescue probable and murder prosecutable. What remains is the connection between a single pilot's heartbeat and a national tempo. Saving one man meant he could fly again and strike again. Multiplied by thousands, rescue became strategy. Prosecuting murders after surrender meant the record would outlast terror. Multiplied by nations, law became deterrent. The generation that built and flew and judged understood that courage without systems is waste, and systems without conscience are machinery turning itself. In museum light, a Hellcat's blue wing throws a shadow over a roll of names. In the hills outside Fukuoka, the cicadas still make their metronome of summer. The sword's edge is sharp at any scale. The assembly line's music is louder. America did not win because it loved war. It won because free people, asked to build and to fight, made abundance precise enough to save as relentlessly as it struck. Somewhere at sea, a rescued pilot warms his hands around a steel mug, while, far away, a clerk writes a name straight as a runway.